introduce you to. This is like, the last session was really pretty hardcore. Christine Bliss and Lila never disappoint. First time hearing having Christine in one of our sessions. Yeah, so we talked about the UK and its role in the world and global strategy. A lot of folks go there, but now let's focus on the whole damn thing. Yeah. So we've got Frank Lavin, he's been with us since our first year. He's been a wonderful ally and collaborator and friend, always in with the great advice and good ideas. And he is the CEO of Export Now, which is an e-commerce platform focused on China. I'm sure that he'll sell it, but at the same time, essentially what they do is that you contract with Export Now, and they make sure that you are in the right places with the right eyes, problem-free in China. So it's a pretty cool company that he runs. But before that, he was the Undersecretary of Commerce and for international trade, and that's a really big job. He's seen a lot, taken a lot of wild phone calls at all hours to make sure that global business runs well. And then before that, he was the US ambassador to Singapore. Before that, he was an executive at Edelman, Bank of America, what else? Citibank, sorry. So a lot of private sector experience, a lot of Beltway experience, and someone with a similar pedigree is Phil Levy, who is he's the chief economist at Flexport. They put together great sessions also, so you should go and watch them. And you were on the policy planning staff at the State Department, the National Economic Council. What else?
Council of Economic Advisors.
National Economic, exactly. And there were a couple of other ones that were on there. You were at Treasury for a little bit, right?
I didn't just have a Treasury. I did a bunch of academic things as well. So, okay. But CEA and
policy planning staff is like that's my secret nerd out spot. Like if I got a job out in Washington, but
it's great. It's a great place to work.
That must have been really cool. And you were there with Bob Zoellick, right?
Yeah, Zoellick was deputy secretary. Steve Krasner was director of policy planning at the time.
Amazing academic. So, yeah. All right, cool. So we've got two amazing people to tell us about what's going on with trade and economic forecasts. Phil's in a really cool position because, you've got figures, right? You're not across all industries, but you see folks are using your platform, you get that stuff right away. And that must be pretty interesting. So Phil,
yeah,
what do we got to say about all these really rosy forecasts out there right now? We got Business Roundtable and Goldman Sachs and everybody else saying that the world is going to be pretty much back to normal, or back to where it was in March of 2020 by probably late Q3. Is this hot air? Is it real? What do you think?
I think it depends a lot on where you look. And the IMF was just out sort of making that distinction a lot. So if you look, China was already supposed to be progressing. Frank can talk more about that. But for the US, yeah, things are looking pretty good. Not all sectors, but overall, we've had a lot of, some groups badly hurt by the pandemic, but then a lot of places really prospering. There's been sort of a turn to getting goods, often when people weren't able to get services. And we normally think that when you get a big slowdown, you get a dip in income. We didn't really see the dip in income because the government stepped in, and you had things like the CARES Act last year and the new stimulus that we've had this year. So if you look at, disposable personal income, it didn't go down. It actually bounced up a lot in the second quarter of 2020. And was up for the year overall. So I think as health concerns recede, the thought is people are going to be primed to do stuff. Often they saved some of that additional income that they had. So I think that's where a lot of this optimism is coming from. It's heavily contingent on getting the health situation under control. So when you see places like Europe, for example, that are still struggling with a new wave, France closing down, postponing some things, the worse that is, that puts a damper on forecasts. We of course care most about the health outcomes, but in economic terms, that slows things down. The US is doing very well actually with vaccinations right now. And so I think that's part of these rosy forecasts.
So how do you feel like this has reorganized the economy though, domestically?
I think, well, so most advanced economies, rule of thumb, 70% services, 30% goods. There's some variation in that, but give or take, that's what they've been. And I think what part of the reorganization we've seen over the course of the pandemic so far was you weren't able to consume services as much. So very big hit to sectors like, restaurants, live entertainment, travel. It's been a real problem for sectors like education, where can you do things remotely? Do you, people start taking a year off before they go back to college? But what it meant was people turned to goods. And so they ordered, home exercise equipment instead of going to the gym. And they order lots of other things. So we've seen a big boom in people purchasing actual goods for the sector that we're in, so moving things around the world. That has meant that whereas everybody anticipated a big slowdown at the onset of the pandemic, thinking, I get it, it's a recession, everything slows. From about last summer, things have just been crazy, technical term. They've been crazy. People talk about this as the endless peak, that we normally have a peak season in the year, usually in advance of the holidays. This has been like peak season nonstop.
Do you think that's because
sending goods? And it's also, you asked about reorganization. Last thing I'll say, there's been a significant change often in the way that those goods are delivered. So a little less traditional retail, a lot where it's things like e-commerce or non-store retailers, if you look in the numbers. So a number of shifts. So shifts towards goods and then shifts towards more e-commerce.
Well, that tees you up nicely, Frank. What do you think? What are you seeing from companies that are like, well, we're doing great at home, let's go to China a little bit more seriously now? Or what do you make of the current situation and what it means for companies that are doing business abroad in general, and of course from where you sit at Export Now these days?
Yeah, thanks, Julian, and thanks for having me on. And I'm glad to be back with my former colleague Phil again and share some thoughts. And I found myself, as is typically the case, in broad agreement with his opening statements. Look, I would say the indirect benefit of economic expansion, economic growth, might be more consequential for international expansion than the direct effect. Meaning the indirect effect is just business confidence is up, that we saw permeating the business environment last year, particularly as early months of last year, early phase of the pandemic. Just a big unknown. How severe was this going to be? How long was it going to be? How much did you have to ratchet down your staff, your production, your sales, your acquisition? And nobody had any appetite for experimenting or trying something new when they were trying to grapple with these sort of macro issues of survival. So all of that, the dust sort of settled. The damage is out there, the disruption is out there, but at least people can dimensionalize it and they understand the magnitude of it and they can work through it. And that's what sort of took place through last year. As we got into this year, there was a real snapback in business confidence and an expansion mode and hunger for new markets, new things, new opportunities, and let's get back on our front foot. We can't spend several years licking our wounds. We've got to grow. So what are the growth opportunities? And that's where you sort of naturally start thinking about international markets. And you mentioned e-commerce, which indeed is a field. I mean, the interesting aspect of e-commerce is that historically companies had to get to a certain level of maturity in their home market before they had the wherewithal or the strength to power through a new market entry. And this just simply drops that threshold significantly. I mean, it drops at 90% or 95%. So on the consumer side, consumer behavior is increasingly digital, and you can access and talk and work and transact with the consumer digitally. And on the investment side, the cost of doing that just continues to drop. So you've got, in the last few years, the emergence of pure play digital brands like Warby Parker and Harry's and so forth. But we say in China, because over 50% of the retail spend in China is digital, over 50% of the retail spend in China is e-commerce. We say every brand is a pure play digital brand. You can show up in China with no physical footprint, with no physical plan at all, just saying, I want to be online, and you're hitting over 50% of the market. And it stands to reason, if you're in the premium space or mass premium space and you're reaching 50% of the retail people online, you're actually hitting 75% of your addressable market, because you're not normally speaking to the very remote or very poor, very elderly segments of the population. So that shift continues apace, and I've been good news for the mid-sized manufacturer, good news for the consumer, and it allows companies to globalize just at a less mature level than they otherwise would have had to wait.
So, it's such an important economic relationship between the United States and China. And China's had a couple of kind of effects after the pandemic, right? The reputational effect from the pandemic and everything that's gone on around it. But the economy rebounded faster. Do you think that it was to such a degree that we should even think much about it? What do you think the real dividends of the way that they were able to control the pandemic and keep growing at that time, do you think that means much in the economic relationship or to China's continued competitive advantage or comparative advantage? Phil?
Look, not from day one, but starting 2 months into it, they had some problems December and January, but as you got into February last year, they did a really good job of getting their hands around it and stopping the spread and getting the economy back to normal quickly. So their economy is performing nicely because of that. I would say it's a separate but still quite relevant issue, the US-China friction, which is, it's been on an uptick, I think, before the Trump administration, but it really moved front and center under Trump. I think it's cooled off a little bit under Biden, although the issues are still there. But at least Biden, temperamentally and publicly, is just stylistically a very different person than Trump. So there's not these day-to-day sort of lightning bolts that were out there. So there's issues out there, and I think it depends what segment of the economy you're in if you're going to encounter a political issue, because some of the segments are government regulated and tougher to work in. If you're telecommunications, you're going to have a tougher time. If you're consumer goods, it's pretty wide open. I would say getting labeling, testing, and approval in China is as easy as any country in the world. And it always shocks my friends from Europe when I say I can take apparel or a food product into China maybe faster than I can take it into the EU, right? It's a very transparent, very regularized system, as you would expect, a massive economy. If you've come up with a face cream or a new brand of peanut butter and you want to sell it in China, it's got to be a regularized system where it's tested and the label's translated and you can sell in the market. So that's a very regularized process.
Phil, what do you think about the dividends of China's swifter recovery?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you mentioned earlier Flexport data, and we were using that to track China's recovery, right after Chinese New Year in 2020, and as one sort of watched the pandemic played out. And you could almost see, I think when one got about 7 or 8 weeks past Chinese New Year, that the constraints switched from being constraints on China's ability to staff the factories, move goods to the ports, operate the ports, get things out, to initially a downturn, then a downturn in Western demand. So I think if you look at the overall effects of the pandemic, it has a whole series of stages. There's that early stage where there was an interruption to supply chains coming from China. And then all the subsequent stages where China was actually functioning better than most of the rest of the world. as they recovered quickly and they got things under control. I mention that because when we hear discussions of these things, there's sometimes a very selective take on that history. So if you listen to some of the policy discussions now, they focus on that very first stretch and they say, if we couldn't get pharmaceuticals or PPE or the things that we wanted at that moment, this shows that we don't have resilient supply chains. We need to do other things about it. It doesn't sort of zoom out and take the larger picture. There has been research that has, but that hasn't fed into a lot of the discussion. So you might well think, Julian, that, yeah, the fact that they've done very well and been a reliable supplier later would sort of feed into a perception that this is a decent place to source. I don't think that's happened in policy terms. And I think that also for businesses, there's this lingering uncertainty about what is the policy going to be. As Frank said, the tone is very different under the Biden administration than it was under the Trump administration. On the other hand, all of those Section 301 tariffs are still there. And the agreement that President Trump had reached on phase one to make certain numerical commitments, you've had nominees who are now appointees under the Biden administration say, well, we're sticking by that, we're enforcing that. I believe the US Trade Rep said that. So I think there's still some, there's an uncertainty that goes with this. It has not, I don't think, won China sort of an all clear as a place for sourcing.
So Frank, if you were in Biden's cabinet, would you give up these negotiating chips without something really nice in return?
You know what? I don't blame USTR Thai for saying what she said, which said we're going to leave these things in place. And Commerce Secretary Raimondo said, look, we can't give up leverage. I don't blame that as their starting point. And one of the kind of pernicious parts of the debate is there's now a political constituency in the US that measures international effectiveness in terms of friction. And if there's friction in place, you're doing a good job. And if you can throw a punch, you're doing a good job. And that's what we see. So they kind of like that about Trump because he liked throwing punches. And Biden, I don't blame him at all, can't say, look, I'm going to unwind all this. But so I don't blame that as a starting point. However, I would expect that privately there's some discussions going on. And in the next 3 to 6 months, we'll see some kind of announcement. This is my conjecture, but this is what I would do if I were in the cabinet. 3 months from now, 6 months from now, you've seen an announcement that both sides are eliminating 25% of the tariffs that are put in place, some kind of baby step, partial correction, to send a positive signal, to do it on a mutual basis, and to take the discussion to the positive zone. No discussion is going to be, no relationship is going to be successful or be able to improve if the discussion is exclusively negative. And one of my worries about how the U.S. conducts U.S.-China relations is that, at least under the previous administration, it was exclusively negative. It was 100%, here's what I don't like about you. And you said, look, by the way, I kind of agree with everything that was said, but I've said, if that's all you're doing is feeding a negative narrative to the exclusive of any other news, watch out, because it's very hard for the other party to move if it's that. So you've got to have at least some element of this be, and by the way, we did this at the height of the Cold War with the Soviets. You'd always look for something to do that was positive, so it was not simply different countries throwing punches at the other country. So I'd say get some positive element going in this agenda, and it makes it possible for there to be progress.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, I think the Biden administration faced a choice when it came in. A really, really difficult thing to do would have been to say, as President Biden had said, I think these tariffs were counterproductive, so let's try a reset. I'm still focused on all the issues, but I want to take a different approach to this. It would have been really hard. He would have been accused of being soft on China. He would have taken a big political hit. And to do that, if you try to do that right at the outset, you don't have your appointees in place. They're still awaiting confirmation, so the execution is hard. So it's not hard to see why he didn't do it. The challenge now, and I think Frank's analysis is perceptive, the challenge now is, let's say they're wise enough to follow Frank's advice. You're talking about 3 to 6 months to take off maybe 25% of the tariffs. You're still now stuck. If you've adopted things like the phase 1 deal, now you're going to have to answer, well, why are you dropping tariffs against them when they didn't meet the numerical targets that you set? And this gets difficult, and you often get locked into these things. Even if you do take 25% off, that means you get 75% left. And so now you're having fairly high damaging tariffs left in place for quite a long time. So if you don't do the reset, you find yourself very gradually working these things away. And at each stage, when you try to do a trade-off, what you're going to find is someone saying, you gave away everything for a handful of beans. That, we still got these all big other issues that you shouldn't have, made any concessions until intellectual property was resolved or until cyber attacks were resolved. And you'll have a litany of concerns. And I'm not minimizing those concerns, but we may find that this stuff sticks around for a while. And that's what businesses have to then be concerned with is, all right, as you're planning your supply chains, for how long are you facing a 25% tariff bringing your goods in from China?
Julian, can I just make a business point
at home? Don't necessarily know much unless they've spent time in Washington, worked in Washington, been around when administrations switch over, is that like most of those kinds of decisions are going to take a long time because it's cabinet folks that have been filled in, maybe a few others, but like there are a lot of appointees that need to be placed, and that's going to take a while. And to really kind of turn around on some of these issues and come up with a policy to replace it or a position or something like that, not only do they have to get in there, but the folks who've been sticking around need to educate them on, okay, we know that this was out in the press, but here's why we did this. And from my month out in Washington last month, I mean, there's a lot of discovery of like, oh, I see why you did that. Okay. It wasn't as crazy as I thought. It was just weird communication style or some, things like that. So I guess if folks at home are thinking about like time, how long it's going to take, those are the kinds of things in the way. And that's why the appointee process is so important. Frank, you were going to say something?
Well, I was trying to connect this discussion that I find pretty useful to a broader business question, which is to say, look, there are a lot of unknowns out there. And one of the unknowns is sort of the political risk factor, the political cost factor. But my core bit of advice to anybody in business is you need to think through a way of moving ahead regardless of these unknowns. And you can go to every Zoom seminar out there on US-China relations. People are going to say, look, we don't know. We think they've improved. We think this, but we don't know. The point is, I hope every business listening in here, whether it's American or third country, says, I need to get my international game up. And I need to come through some sort of strategy over the next 12 months so that I'm allocating a little bit of time, a little bit of resources to international market development. And China might be on that list just because of the size of the economy. But I think a lot of business decisions just come down to cost-benefit analysis. So it's really a question of what is the business's appetite for international expansion? How much resources do they have to allocate against this task? And how do they market size? How do they determine the relative opportunities in each market? And it's kind of an MBA exercise. And if you're Procter & Gamble, you've got 100 people doing this in Cincinnati. But and if you're Toyota, you've got 200 people doing this. But even a business that most U.S. businesses are mid-sized, have no strategic planning, they grow organically. But even if you're in that category, you can bring on an intern from an MBA program, and you can say, I need you to try to understand how big the Mexican market would be for our product, how big China might be, how big UK might be, how big Canada might be, and let's show me your methodology, and let's have a management discussion about what we would need to do to get into these markets. So let's at least ask the questions, even if we don't have all of the answers, right? So I think that planning and discovery phase, which is not that expensive. I mean, if you make food products, Julian, you can send your MBA student down to Mexico City for a long weekend with a smartphone and say, I need you to go into the top 10 supermarkets in Mexico City, and I need you to photograph this product array and what's being sold there and what SKUs are being sold there and what prices are being sold there. And that's my competitive research. That's my market research. I know what's actually selling in Mexico City. And
I'll put it on the record that you can hire me to do that. I'm going to Mexico City right about now. I would love to go. So if anyone wants to take photos in a supermarket so that I can party it up in Mexico City, let's roll.
That's right. All I'm saying is get in the game. It's an imperfect world, and there's sort of imperfect answers. But I would say in that sense, the foreign market is no different than your home market, meaning when your company was started 10 years ago or 50 years ago, it wasn't 100% sure what the demand would be or what the success would. Now here we are years later, it's working. It's fantastic. You can go through that same journey in a new market, and you've got to start that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the folks on the who've been watching, they've done quite well. They're e-commerce companies. Folks are just sitting at home ordering their stuff. They've been noodling around on the internet. They've been playing video games, watching streaming. Like they're like, we've got a rare opportunity to go and conquer the world right now. Let's go do it. So,
well, Julian, I was just going to say, Julian, just example, 2,000 shoe companies in the world. What determined that Nike was going to be a global major? I think Philip Knight determined that. Philip Knight said, I think I've got something that is technically better than a lot of other athletic shoes, and I think I can sell this. But I'm going to have to make that decision myself and make it work myself. 10,000 coffee shops in America. What determined that Starbucks was going to be a global major? Well, I think Howard Schultz determined. I mean, he had a better product, he had a better system, so he had some advantages, but it was only because this guy had the adrenaline and the appetite for a little bit of a risk, a little bit of the unknown that made that difference. But if you don't start that journey, you're not going to be in that top tier. You're not going to have it. You don't need to be Nike to be successful. But the point is, you have to have some allocation of your management bandwidth has to be toward asking questions and a little bit of experimentation and a little bit of resource allocation into new markets.
So given that, a lot of these companies are doing pretty well, but they're looking at shaky circumstances in some parts of the world. It's probably all gravy for them, in many cases, right? If they were doing well here under the pandemic, then they may do just as well there, right? Like, I can think of a few territories where that's probably not the case, right? Like Latin America has really gotten hit hard. They're having a lot of trouble in quite a few spots down there. But Europe is probably going to rebound in a similar kind of, I don't know. What are you seeing, Phil? I mean, they can control themselves, and they know that there's a lot of demand at the company level. I guess the only remaining factors, aside from all the stuff that we cover in our conference, right? Like, how do you do it? Is like, what are the conditions on the ground? What do you think?
I guess I'd say two things. So one, we just had the IMF issue their World Economic Outlook, and they described a real divergence between developed and developing economies in terms of how things grow. You mentioned the difficulties in Latin America, but elsewhere, that for a lot of the developing world, it's a much more challenging situation. It's harder. The norm was, of course, that developing countries grew much faster than developed because they had the capacity to do this. Less so. And so it's a much more pessimistic forecast, concerns about what will happen if money floods out of them. So I don't think you want to think about this as the whole world is ready to flourish. At least that's not the situation they were describing. You are right that there's other parts of the world that are doing well. It's useful that you're addressing this and that Frank does the stuff that he does, because one of the things that a number that sticks in my mind coming out of the Commerce Department, it's a few years old now, was they did a survey of companies that export. And I think if I remember the number correctly, maybe you know this one too, Frank, it was of companies that export, I think 58% just exported to a single country.
Yeah.
I remember this. I saw this.
Yes, which is kind of striking, because you would have thought, what stops you from exporting? Well, maybe you don't know how to export, or maybe you don't have a product that works. These were all selected as companies that did have that, but it kind of tells you that there is a challenge to moving on. It's not simply, well, I do this successfully at home, or even I do it successfully in one export market, therefore I can do it all over the place. There are some challenges there.
I think that's a really good observation, Phil. I always called that group the accidental exporters, meaning there's not a export philosophy or new market philosophy or an international philosophy that's governing behavior, but they happen to get an email in from somebody in Korea who said, hey, I love your product, and I'll take $10,000 a month of your product because it's really cool. And they say, well, that's fantastic. That's like winning the lottery. That's just somebody likes you. So you'd say, and I think you and I would have the same reaction, Julian, too, to say, hey, if there's one guy in Korea there, there's got to be somebody in other countries that feels the same way. I've got to find more friends. I've got to go to these trade shows. I've got to get around a bit and see if I can replicate this. But you're right. A lot of companies said, well, I don't know. My job is to respond to orders that come in. And I really only have an active sales team in the US, and we beat the bushes in the US, and I get a lot of orders. And then I occasionally, once a year I get something from overseas, but I can't do anything about it. And I don't do anything about it, which is, to my mind, that's a mistake. But I think it governs human behavior.
One thing I can say about the audience that we've been cultivating, especially for Grow to Market, is that these are not the I'm comfortable being a $10 million company and having a great vacation situation, send my kid to school. We make, this one aerospace part, never going to sell, don't need to worry about exporting. Like, these are all pretty aggressive folks.
Great.
It's been wonderful to see. So I think what you're saying, Frank, is resonant with both of you. Really resonant stuff. One thing that I think that we mentioned earlier is that we export, like our top two places that we sell goods to is Canada and Mexico. Mexico has been having some trouble with the virus and economically. What do you think about, what have you been watching the Mexico situation, Phil? Anything that you know about that?
I have watched some, I think, in that Mexico has a number of difficulties. So they're sharing some of the health difficulties of Latin America. And then there's some challenges, I think, with sort of governance and the sort of the regulatory environment in Mexico as they decide which businesses, are allowed to stay open when they have closures. Do you take into account, for example, whether or not businesses are part of a supply chain or a North American supply chain? There were a lot of complaints over the last year from North American businesses in the US or Canada that those factors weren't being taken into account. This is often a more domestic consideration. So a number of challenges in Mexico. And I think also, as you look, one might have thought that with the sort of dispute over NAFTA resolved and with the new USMCA in place, that this would sort of clear the air in policy terms. I don't think it's going to have that effect. I think there were some unrealistic portions in the USMCA, and it actually sets itself up for a number of disputes, and we see those bubbling up. So I think it may be a challenge. There's all sorts of goodwill to do something, but it's a challenging time.
Are you thinking of like rules of origin on that? Like, is that the first thing that comes to mind?
So the rules of origin, in terms of what was unrealistic, autos is huge. I mean, if you want to think about sort of North America and what they're doing and what USMCA was about, the auto sector, the most integrated sector in North America and a very quantitatively important sector. But yes, the sort of requirements for rules of origin, requirements for minimum pay to meet this. Can one even track these things? And then there's a number of other things where it sort of gave grounds for disputes, and the early rumblings are that there are a number of parties that are interested in taking advantage of that and pressing disputes. So we may see a more contentious time with Mexico from the US.
Yeah, they really had an opportunity, though, at the end of USMCA and with the dispute with China and all the other trade agreements that they had. Like, it felt like Mexico was strutting for a minute, and then they just didn't seize the moment. I hope they're able to get back into the funk. What about Canada, Phil?
For Canada, I have not followed their health situation or their economic situation as closely. I think that there are fewer points of dispute with the Canadians. The main challenge with the Canadians is we've each, I think, done a very practical challenge at the moment. It has not been a coordinated health response, and I think you have a difficulty at the moment just even moving back and forth with Canada, which is not the norm for the U.S. You pointed out that these were our two closest partners. This is a fairly standard economic regularity that economists like to talk about the gravity equation, which is that sometimes trade works a little bit like gravity, that the bigger the body is, the more you do stuff. Think in terms of GDP, not mass of a planet, and the closer they are, the more you do stuff. So when you get a relatively big country like Canada very nearby, The norm is to have a lot of economic activity. I think for them, we probably have put a lot of the disputes behind us. There may be a lack of trust there, some bruising from the last 4 years. The Canadians were not by any means.
They're so relieved.
Yeah, well, I don't think they were enthused when they were told that they were a national security threat because they, of our, say, like integrated aluminum industry.
Yeah.
We'll see how quickly those sort of bruised feelings heal. But I think there's probably an eagerness to do things differently.
Yeah. And Frank, I'm not ignoring you. I was just teeing you up for something. We've chatted for a long time, and the kind of one of the funny things that you and I have gone back and forth about is like the way that a lot of companies think about strategy. They'll, and this is not this crowd, or at least not most of it, but it does happen, right? Where you get someone, he's been reading the Financial Times or the New York Times about the Chinese economy or something like that. It gets really excited, saw something on CNBC and is like, all right, we're going straight to China. And the joke that you used to tell was that, like, look, you got Canada right next, and you got Canada right next door. If you have a fire in your distribution center, do you want to be dealing with the Canadian fire department, or do you want to be dealing with the Chinese one? Now you solve that problem by saying you will deal with the Chinese one and you can just deal with me. But I don't know. Has that calculation changed much? I know that there's just been an explosion of e-commerce tools. Quite a few of them are observing us today.
First, I think your premise. I think your premise is exactly right, Julian. That companies, all of us, human nature is such that we overweigh the moment. And actually, I would say if you've decided you're going into France this year, great. But France's actual GDP performance has very little impact on your success, barring the end of the bell curve. If there's a complete economic meltdown, fine, you're going to have a problem. But whether France grows at 2% or 1.8% or 2.5% just doesn't matter. And you can spend a lot of time saying, I've got to get France's GDP exactly right. I just don't think that's true. You're going into France because you're offering something to a customer that isn't currently being offered. You're going to try to, you've got a better solution, a better product, a better brand, better feature, something, and you can have some success in the market by showing up. But so the question is more a mechanical kind of questions, tactical set of questions, meaning how do I calibrate my cost and benefit so that I'm way out of whack? How do I calibrate scale in my step function of market entry? Because what I don't want to do is set up a warehouse trucking operation in France that's going to sell $10 million a year, and on my first year I'm only selling $1 million. Then I've made some really bad mistakes. I'm servicing debt and cost, right? But if I had said on day one I might just hit $1 million year one, you'd say that's a reasonable first year outlet. That's not necessarily bad for somebody just showing up in a brand new market. So it has a lot more to do with how lumpy or sticky is your product delivery, and do you need to have a lot of CapEx, and do you need to have large scale purchases, or can you calibrate smaller amounts? So whether you sell 1 million in France this year or 1.8 million, you still say, you know what, I had a great year. I had a really great year. Had a nice launch, and we're going to go up 30%, we think, next year. So that set of questions is, I think, more important than the newspaper questions about, oh, there's a cabinet change in France, so there's a new tax policy in France, or so there's a pandemic problem in France. I mean, all of which are kind of interesting background noise, but they have nothing to do with your fundamental look. And by the way, the core before the pandemic, the metaphor for the set of issues you described, Julian, was Brexit. That had a lot of folks
discussing this in the last session.
But every single person you're talking to is saying, look, I'm supposed to be in UK next year, but I don't know what Brexit's going to mean. And I'm saying, look, the short answer is it doesn't mean anything. It does not mean anything for your market entry and your success in Britain. Brexit will have some impact on, can I reallocate inventory perhaps to the EU there's going to be some additional cost. But fundamentally, whether you're successful or not in the market is a different set of skills based on your agility, your creativity, your product strengths, and are really unrelated to macroeconomic fundamentals or whatever weird things might be going on in London.
Yeah, I told him that. I told him you say that.
Yeah.
I said, Frank is going to say this.
Yeah.
All the time.
Well, it also tells you we have this incredible fear of the unknown. We just, if you ask, and look, I've got a lot of respect for we deal mainly with mid-tier US businesses, and this might be a few $100 million company, but basically they built it themselves. They built it up over 10, 20, 30 years, and they built it by refining a set of skills around a set of products that's very successful. So you got to really respect that. And to go to that person and say, would you please do a risk analysis about Mexico or Brexit or China? The guy says, you got to be kidding me. I've spent 30 years building up an array of face creams, and I'm doing very well, and I know nothing. I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know any of this stuff, and I'm not going to go near something I don't know. That's, by the way, it's not a bad response. It's not an illogical response. All I'm saying is, fine, even if you don't know it at all, because of e-commerce or maybe some other channels, you can probably still do something in these markets with very little exposure, meaning you don't have to set up a legal entity in Britain. You don't have to hire 30 people in Britain. You don't have to buy a warehouse in Britain. You can still probably go to a trade fair in Britain and talk to people in the cosmetics industry in Britain reasonably inexpensively. I mean, you can go spend a long weekend there and see the top 20 distributors of cosmetics, then go visit them and give out sample packs and to say, I signed 1 or 2 guys as distributors. So there's less expensive ways of entering a market than anything that involves capital expenditure or personnel or formal commitments of investment.
Yeah. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? Like there's some things that people get worried about that they shouldn't be, and then there are things that they shouldn't be worried about, or that there are things that they should worry about and they don't, things that they reverse, whatever. I've been doing this, I'm going on, wrapping up my 6 hours. Been hosting this all day, and I'm dyslexic. But the point is, people were not thinking about tariffs with the Trump administration. They were not thinking about these kinds of things. They thought that this was just voodoo, hocus pocus, this political speak. And then the next thing you hear is that folks are going out of business in Michigan because that resource that they were importing, or that part that they were importing, priced them out of their market, and they folded up, or had to fire a bunch of people. And then, of course, then you hear about Brexit, and everybody was worried, sky's falling, freaking out, and now they're talking about, I think Christine Bliss said something crazy. I hadn't heard this before. It was something like 80% of their global trade they want under FTAs in the next 3 years.
Wow.
Wild. So, this is not a country that's pulling back from the world.
Yeah, I'll tell you, can I jump in? I haven't looked at this number in a few years, but I think in the US, if we take the US out of it, our FTA partners account for something like 8 to 10% of global GDP, right? I mean, some mid-sized countries in there like Canada and Mexico, Australia, a lot of smaller countries like Israel and Singapore, but it's about 8 or 10% of global GDP, of non-US global GDP, but about 40% of US exports go to that. It might be a little higher, that might be 45%, but it just shows you. And we saw when I worked on the US-Singapore FTA that, look, tariffs weren't high to begin with, but it was a very important signal to market that you have a lot of US businesses say, I don't know anything about Singapore. I have no particular desire to go to Singapore. And we say, well, we have a free trade agreement. Singapore is just like Canada. You can do whatever you want in that market. Sort of any legal business activity you can undertake in the US, you can undertake in Canada, you can undertake in Singapore. So you don't have to adjust and modify tariff. It's a fabulous market for you. So that was a huge selling point, huge messaging point for the US business community.
One other thing that you mentioned a moment ago that I flagged is that I guess you meet these kind of folks. I don't meet them much I meet them every now and then, right? Like I send them a cold email or something like that. Hey, I've got this thing. Looks like you're doing something cool. Do you want to come? And they're like, nope, all domestic, all good. Thank you. Fine. And I know that they're, probably $300-400 million company. And then, all right, fine. The ones I get a little bit more often, and everybody who's watching at home, they get my emails, my direct emails direct into their inbox. It's I do that with a lot of people, and I'm constantly reaching out to new folks. I got a lot of cocky ones where they're like, we're in 5 markets and this and that. And I'm looking at, you know, when you're around these kinds of companies enough, you start to recognize, like, you look at their org chart, the kinds of titles folks have, you look at where they've got their offices, some press on who they're hiring, where they came from. You start to get the picture of, like, do these folks know what they're doing? The cockiest ones never know what they're doing.
Yeah,
like, it's
yeah,
really, really funny. And it's
that's,
usually in the mid-tier.
That's really good insight. It's interesting how much this international behavior depends on personal self-awareness, and
Yeah.
some people have some appetite for the unfamiliar, or some appetite for risk, and some just have none. And I'm saying, look, I don't know what the answer is. Every individual is different, every company is different. So I can't tell you devote X% of your marketing budget to Mexico. That's you to figure that out. But all I can say is the answer cumulatively for international, the answer should not be zero. Don't have it be zero, have it be something. Even if you say once a year we go to a trade fair in Mexico, or once a year we go to this trade fair in the UK, or we're doing a little market study of China e-commerce and seeing if which of our competitors are online in China and how much are they selling, and then we can at least project, you know, if our 3 competitors are $5 million each online in China, we might hit $5 million each on China. And how do we get there? So you at least have to ask the question.
Well, you know what Ali Holvik from Honey, formerly at PayPal, the same company, but she's leading Honey now, their go-to-market strategies. She and the guy from Digital River, Ted Rogers, they were talking about how easy it is to just open up the entire platform and just start testing things, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Especially for digitally enabled companies, the answer should not be zero, right?
Yeah.
Phil, we're coming down to the end of the discussion and the end of my day, where I'm going to pass out for 20 hours.
Face planted in cheesecake.
Yes, cheesecake, give it to me. Out on the lanai. As you gaze out into the future, where we are now domestically and internationally, like, what do you think are, like, the 3 things that companies really need to be thinking about for themselves, their own prospects, their own vitality? Let's say that they're, you know, physical goods and delivered, you know, via means that Flexport would be monitoring, or perhaps even digital ones, if you think much about that. Like, what do you say?
I don't know if I'm going to have a good 3-item list. Shows my deficiencies as a guru. But I actually think I'll go with 2 broad categories here. I think Frank made an excellent point earlier, which is some of this is just plain business. You know, what is your product? Can you go into this market? How you can use it? So you're, in that sense, it's much more idiosyncratic than it is what's going on with the broader economy, what's going on with policy, you know, trade barriers, logistics, shipping, and all of that. So there's that, but I'm less qualified to speak to that because it's idiosyncratic by the way I defined it. I think so. Whether these are in the top 3, I think as you look forward and you think some of the sort of concerns on the horizon that are there for bigger picture things for companies. Some of what we've been talking about trade policy in the China context more, a little bit of Brexit, a little bit of USMCA, but there's more to it than that. We actually have the system that has sort of protected us, I think, from trade disputes, the World Trade Organization, which, you know, prior to that was the GATT and really was one of the great creations of the post-war era. That is faltering right now. It's got some new leadership, but it's got 2 pillars, really. One pillar is a place to sort of resolve disputes. And the other pillar is, where can we negotiate mutually beneficial stand downs or new rules? And neither one is functioning very well at the moment. And that's a concern. That, you know, what does the world look like if that all falls apart? That could be a bit problematic. And then if you're a business, you're thinking, what protections do I have under this? And that might be, is there a free trade agreement that covers things? Do I have some recourse? There's also the general macro environment that we're thinking about. So if you look in the US, as we talked about, you've got sort of boom times coming. But one of the concerns, you mentioned different kinds of businesses, one of the concerns is, do we maintain our passion for goods? That there was a switch in the way people did consumption, we talked about earlier, when they sort of went from more services to more goods, not all the way over, but in relative terms. We just don't know, and a lot of businesses I know are watching this one in particular, what happens when we get past the pandemic. Do we then revert and say, okay, now we go back to our old consumption habits? Or are these new habits that then have staying power? And so this is what a lot of people are watching for, is what's a telltale sign? When is it that, you stop ordering home gym equipment and you're going back to the gym instead? Or that, no, this is the new norm and I don't like working out in front of other people and I'm used to doing it in my new setup. So it's those are a few sort of broad trends. I don't know if that meets the 3 items criteria.
I'm gonna be permanently in athleisure forever.
Yeah, exactly.
Any suits I buy are going to be cool ones, which was amazing out in DC, by the way. Everyone went to go visit like US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. The guy that started that, Mukesh Aghi, he was dressed like I was. We were in jeans and t-shirts. It was amazing. I was like, wow, Washington's changed.
Yeah.
Well, that was really helpful. Frank, any parting thoughts, words of wisdom?
Well, you can gather, Julian, that my main theme is a company's international success has much less to do with the international situation, which the company can't affect in any event, but it has a lot to do with the company's own DNA, their own culture. And the challenge for a lot of these successful mid-sized companies is their growth has been organic by doing a narrow set of activities, but they do something extremely well. So they've really got market traction and market respect, and it's really kind of working. And so but the problem is there's a deformation. There's a bias now to say we just, more of the same is sort of the business mantra. And if you ask that businessman, what do you want to do tomorrow? He says, well, I want to do tomorrow what I did today. I'm at $500 million and I'm growing 10% a year, and that's a pretty good deal. And he said, that is actually very, very impressive. I love this guy and what he's built out. But there's a sort of a cost for that, because there's this black hole of behavior patterns that you establish in this company, that's all they do. And it works until it stops working. So what I'd say to somebody is this is a metaphor for international activity, but allocate some of your resources to beyond the next quarter, beyond the next few quarters. What if the market shifts? What if consumers shift? What if tastes shift? What if the international picture shifts? And you can only do this MOTS, more of the same strategy, for a finite amount of time. And every single person in the US who's making carburetors is going to be supplanted, not 100%, not even 20%, but they're going to be supplanted by electric vehicle motors that don't need carburetors. Every single hog farmer in the US is going to be supplanted, not 100%, but by the impossible meats and the vegetarian substitutes for meat products. So there's going to be evolution in the marketplace. And because you've got a successful model and you're making that model work the best you can, that's terrific. But that model's going to shift and the market's going to shift, technology's going to shift. So my core bit of advice to everybody on this call is the world's not standing still. Please don't you stand still either.
Actually, if I can follow that up with a shamelessly self-serving point, Frank talks about how things evolve, and he's absolutely right. One of the things that's evolved in all this is, in the same way that we saw that the production of goods got in a way easier because you could make different parts in different places, so you could sort of cut out the most costly stages in your process. There's a bit of this also, I think, with the go-to-market element, that you're getting a variety of companies, mine among them, that will sort of help you move things, help you do stuff, help solve logistics issues. So that if you sort of realize the wisdom of what Frank is saying, it's not entirely and you're on your own and go figure this out. There's a whole bunch of opportunities there that make things easier than they used to be.
Yeah, could I just say every single person on this call, can I just say everybody on this call ought to follow up with Flexport, follow up with Phil. They have webinars. There's a lot of instructional material. We're happy on our end to be shamelessly self-serving as well. If people are interested in e-commerce, if e-commerce is working, we say as well, China is a bigger e-commerce market than the US. So we're happy to get you going in China e-commerce. So there's a lot of friends, allies, partners, collaborators out there. Phil's exactly right.
Yeah, and what you're saying is one of the reasons why I really like communicating by email with a lot of the audience. You know, I know that folks are into like social media and whatever, but like every now and then they'll write me something private that's just so illuminating and interesting, and a week later meet exactly the vendor or the specialist or expert that solves that problem and put them together. Yeah, it's really important. I mean, one of the things that our first year, we had the guy who was leading Taco Bell into Southeast Asia, and he was telling me, or he spoke in this a session and said, no, after the session, he said, you know, I was just kind of amazed at how many resources there are around here. Like all the people that you meet, you know, they cover some area that makes it easier for me to do my job and focus on things that I actually care about. Like some of this stuff is free too. Like I had no idea that this existed. You Taco Bell, you know? So anyway, I'm plugging myself at the end of the day, but all you folks
you want to hire Julian for advice, and as Phil said, you know, your bank, you know, your bank will have an international group, your accounting firm will have an international group. So
and they know all kinds of other people who also can be helpful. So you're not alone. I just like being helpful and keeping the network tight, but sometimes folks ask me to do interesting, cool things, as Frank knows. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for doing this with us today. This was a big day. I'm wrapping up my 6th hour, and had a lot of fun though. This was really, really great. Everyone out who stuck with us until the end, you guys are superstars. I love you. Well done. And sorry for all the technical issues earlier. We're in a big, crazy looking studio situation here, but the camera decided to give out, and so now I'm basically doing what I would have done at home in a studio. So anyway, thank you all very much. We will be coming back to you with more, probably on supply chains and trade first, and then something on social good, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the next edition of Grow to Market, which I anticipate will probably be in July. So I'm going to get some rest now and get started on all of those. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.